Hi, everybody. I'm Alistair Stevens, and welcome to This Week on Point North, our Monday morning discussion, Monday afternoon discussion, where we talk about what you can expect from Point North Media in the week to come. This is going to be an interesting week because it is Thanksgiving here in the US, which basically has no effect on our broadcast schedule at all here at Point North, except that Thursday's There and Back Again slot has been moved to Wednesday. That's it. That's basically it. That's the whole thing right there. We're also, though, importantly, beginning 2 new books this week. I'm very excited. I've been doing a lot of reading over the course of the last few days, not least of all because I also managed to cram in an extra There and Back Again session last night, which was a ton of fun. If you haven't yet heard it, the live video is available now on Crowdcast. It has just finished uploading to YouTube, so it'll be available over there as well. And it went out in the podcast feed this morning. But if you haven't yet listened to the latest episode of There and Back Again, it's a really fun discussion in part about the Amazon adaptation of Tolkien's work, this Lord of the Rings prequel series that has been talked about relentlessly on the internet over the course of the last week. And then we wrap up our discussion of Gandalf's return. Minor spoilers for The Two Towers, I guess, if you're not following along with There and Back Again. But, you know, Gandalf comes back. He falls in Khazad-dûm, but it's going to be okay, you guys. He gets an extra life here and battles the Balrog deep beneath the earth in Khazad-dûm, ascends to the highest peak, casts down the Balrog, and then something mysterious happens to him, which we discuss in great depth in the last episode of There and Back Again. This week, we're actually moving on to Rohan. We're moving on to the Golden Hall. We're moving on to Theoden King, and we're moving into the politics of Middle-earth a little more readily. This is one of my favorite sequences in the book. I kind of love this stuff. I love pretty much everything that we get from Rohan, actually. It's really interesting to see an entirely new community that has fallen under the shadow, new to us community that has fallen under the influence of the shadow, but not the direct influence of the shadow, right? This is the corruptive presence of Sauron, the corruptive presence of evil, you know, theologically in Middle-earth, philosophically in Middle-earth. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that. Before we get to our actual breakdown of what to expect this week, though, let me make good on the tease that I promised, or the tease that I offered you last week, and share this with you. This, as I'm sure you recognize, is pointnorthmedia.com. This is the website which, good Lord, is in need of some maintenance and some upgrading here. I am going to redesign the Point North website at some point in the next few weeks, but there are also a couple of other things that are vying for my time and attention over the course of the next few weeks, because I don't know if you guys have heard, but we're going to have a new Star Wars pretty soon, and I'm going to be talking about it in Story and Star Wars. And before I talk about The Last Jedi in Story and Star Wars, I also want to circle back around and talk more about The Force Awakens and offer a few kind of wrap-up thoughts on Rogue One. I think that the discourse surrounding Rogue One has moved in a really interesting direction over the course of the last few months, and I want to kind of enter into that debate a little bit, talk a little about what Rogue One is, talk a little about what Rogue One isn't, and talk a little about what Rogue One means for the future of the Star Wars series, particularly the anthology films. I'm curious about what we're going to get from the Han Solo movie, thinking about Rogue One in particular. But before we get to all of that, let's talk a little about Between Worlds, exploring folklore, fairy, and fantasy. This is the class that I am going to run early in the new year. It begins at the beginning of January. This is a 6-week live class. It's going to be basically a gloss of the history of folklore and fairy tale. This is the class that I have been talking about for, I don't know, years now. This has been one of those things that has been on my, hey, someday I'm going to do this list, and it's finally arrived. It's finally here, and I could not be more excited. So we are going to begin, if I scroll down here. In fact, let me just read this. Let me read the quote that I have pulled here from J.R.R. Tolkien's fantastic essay on fairy stories, just to kind of prime the pump, just to get you all excited for this. The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In that realm a man may, perhaps, count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates be shut and the keys be lost. This is our introduction to fairy, and we are going to look at how fairy began, its oldest roots in myth and in folklore, its emergence into medieval fairy tale, medieval fantasy, then through the Elizabethan and Victorian periods, all the way through to the modern day. We are going to begin in the first week by looking at On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien, which I've also discussed as a part of There and Back Again, but it is honestly one of the best nonfiction essays ever written. I just adore it. So we're definitely going to talk about that again. We're going to gloss the hero with Worth a Thousand Faces from Joseph Campbell. This is the monomyth. This is the hero's journey structure. The original Joseph Campbell book is fantastic. I am wildly critical of the broad application of the hero's journey to stories which are not hero's journey stories. That is a distressing and somewhat thoughtless trend in literary analysis. But when you're talking about fairy tales and you're talking about actual hero's journey stories, it's just brilliant. It's a genius piece of comparative analytical work. So we're going to gloss that too. And we're going to talk about C.S. Lewis's Sometimes Fairy Stories May Say Best What's to Be Said, which is kind of his companion piece to Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. We're going to talk about that in the first week and talk about what fairy stories are. What is fairy? Capital F-A-E-R-I-E. What are fairies? What are elves? How do all of these things fit together? What are the Celtic and Norse and Germanic traditions of fairies? What are the Latin and Greek traditions of fairies? The Roman and Greek traditions of fairies? What about fairies from other parts of the world? Why do we talk about fairy pretty much everywhere that you go on the surface of the earth? Why is this, in a very powerful sense, our core and fundamental shared mythology? We're going to talk about all of that in the first week. Then in week 2, we're going to get into it. We're going to get into the medieval texts. We're going to get into Sir Orfeo, which is written in Middle English. It's very short. It's written in Middle English. It is absolutely charming. This is actually a Middle English medieval adaptation of the story of Odysseus. It's in part, the story of Odysseus. It's absolutely fascinating. So we're going to talk about Sir Orfeo, and then we're going to talk about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you know, this classic medieval conception of elves and fairy. In week 3, we're going to talk about the evolution of fairy through the Elizabethan period. We're going to, of course, talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is one of the bridging texts between the medieval perspective on fairy and a kind of Victorian modern perspective on fairy. It's a really interesting text from that perspective. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to gloss The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser. In week 4, we're going to talk about fairy tales. We're going to pivot just a little bit and talk about where fairy tales came from, our modern conception of fairy tales. So of course, we're going to talk about the work of Charles Perrault, who gathered and collated and codified fairy tales from all over Western Europe at the time. We're also, of course, going to talk about the Brothers Grimm, and we're going to talk about Hans Christian Andersen, who was in many ways the inheritor of a tradition that had barely been established at that point, and wrote new fairy tales in that mode and measure. Then in week 5, we're going to talk about the roots of modern fantasy. We're going to talk about the emergence of modern fantasy from the riot of Victorian fairy tales. So we're, of course, going to talk about The Princess and the Goblin by Scots author George MacDonald, and we're going to talk about Peter and Wendy by J.M. Barrie, one of those formative texts, right? One of those texts that absolutely indicates the direction in which fairies are going to go in popular culture through the 20th century. Then we're going to move into the 20th century in our final session. We're going to talk about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from 1937 and The Little Mermaid from 1989, talking about the Disney influence on fairy tales and basically using those two movies as a way of demarcating exactly what it is that happens to fairy tales in the 20th century. I'm really excited to do that. And then we're going to talk about Coraline by Neil Gaiman, and probably talk a little about the movie adaptation of Coraline too, to talk about the ways in which fairy tales have kind of morphed into something more approaching magical realism, more approaching general kind of fantasy, but a specific kind of fantasy. So all of that is going to happen in the Between Worlds class. I urge you to register today. I've already had quite a few registrants, and spaces are filling up fast. If you're at all interested in that class, then definitely check it out. If you can't make the live class times, these classes are going to go out at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central on Monday evenings. That's my usual, Point North class slot. As I say, it's going to run for 6 weeks, and there's going to be some homework discussion and some extra reading assignments, and the reading burden is quite heavy. There's quite a lot to get through in that period, which is pretty good because I think most people have a fairly empty January and February and are looking for things to do in that time as we while away the winter months, waiting for spring to come again. So it's going to be pretty intense over the course of those 6 weeks. If you can't make the live sessions, or if January and February are just very bad for you, don't worry. There will be a downloadable version of the class available after the fact. That will be available around the middle of February, middle to end of February, I guess. You'll be able to pick up the whole thing in one big pack and go through it at your own pace. It should be a lot of fun. I'm super excited about it. I'm just super excited about it. Let's see. Becca says, Thumbelina is so fairy. Hans Christian Andersen is one of my favorite Hanses. Definitely top 3 Hans, right? Like if you write your list of Hanses, which I know we all have, we've all done that. We've all, doodled on the front of our Trapper Keepers, the top 3 Hanses that we love. Hans Christian Andersen definitely belongs on that list, right? Does Hans Solo count? Hans Olo, would he also count as a favorite Hans? I would probably stretch the definition that far. Yes. Good. Hans the counting horse. Hans Gruber says Art K. Yes. And Becca says, don't laugh, I have a list. Becca, I'm not laughing at you, I'm laughing with you. This is sincere affection and adoration that is happening right now, I promise. Good. Says who, says Jenna, referring to, I presume, an empty January and February. My sister is getting married. I am going to be busy. Wow. An early year marriage. I like that quite a lot. I've always been fond of like early year marriages. That seems like a, I don't know, my favorite holiday, let me cancel the slide. My favorite holiday has always been New Year, right? I love Thanksgiving and I love New Year. These are holidays which, and of course, Thanksgiving I've only learned to love recently since coming to this fine land. But New Year, Hogmanay, has always been my favorite holiday. I've always been attracted to that idea of renewal and rebirth and new opportunity. I am by nature an optimist, and there is something about New Year, there's something about Hogmanay, there's something about that convivial repudiation of the darkness, right? You gather together and you force back winter. You say, no, we will not hunker down and wait for the passing of the season. We will instead illuminate the darkness and share gloriously our enthusiasm and our hope for the new year. I'm very much into that. I know it's not maybe cool to be such an optimist, but I just can't help it, you guys. That's just where I am. Yeah, good. Jenna says, I'm partial to Jewish New Year, which is in the fall, the best month. Season, she corrects herself. Fall isn't a month. Jewish New Year, yeah, see, any kind of New Year, I'm super into it. I'm very, very into the idea of this renewal. For me personally, there is something about that darkness, about that frigidity, you know, when the world is cold and crystalline outside, but inside, particularly if you're having a Scots raucous Hogmanay, the contrast there between the frigid crystalline world outside and the raucous conviviality inside, that's something that warms my heart. That's something that speaks to me very powerfully. So I am, of course, already very excited for the new year, not least of all because 2018 can only be better than 2017. And I know that we said that at the end of 2016. I know that we all did this thing last Hogmanay where we said, well, hey, at least 2017 is going to be better, right? Well, sometime we've got to be right is the thing. Sometimes we've just got to be correct in our prediction here. So I'm hoping that is going to work. Yeah. Hans Holbein the Younger painting Hans Gruber reading Hans Christian Andersen, suggests Becca. That sounds fantastic. That sounds just fantastic. I want fan art of that immediately. Yes. Good. So Sundari says, wait, Alistair, is Hogfather an actual thing in Scotland or something? Referencing the Hogfather tradition from Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels. Not quite. No, it's not exactly right. But it's also not exactly wrong either, right? There's a rich tradition, both in the real world and in fantasy fiction, of these midwinter celebrations. And it's one of these things that Terry Pratchett was very quietly, but very fearsomely brilliant. He had a remarkable intellect, just a remarkable intellect. He had an understanding of stories that is as profound as anyone that you can name. He was as deeply inured in the world of narrative, in the tug and the tide of narrative as anyone that you can name. But he didn't really demonstrate it analytically, right? He didn't demonstrate it academically, because he would, instead of writing about stories, simply use that vast insight to tell new stories. So when he's pulling ideas like the Hogfather, which is completely silly, you know, Hogswatch Night on the disc, this is completely silly, but at the same time, it speaks to these ancient traditions and these, I genuinely think, primal human urges, right? We are oftentimes told that we are the products of our societies, which I think is certainly true in some part. It's true in some measure, right? We absorb a great deal. Humans are learning machines, and we internalize the stories that we are told. And most of the stories that we are told as we are growing up are stories about us, both individually and socially. We're told the story of who we are and where we are and why we are, but we also reflexively impact our societies enormously, you know, and you can see that happen more fluidly and more rapidly on the internet, you know, thanks to this digital connection that allows us to talk freely across great distances and in some interesting ways across spans of time too. You can see us actively modify our environments, modify our cultures, which I think is one of the reasons that so many people have pushed back against Twitter in the last few weeks, in the last few months, last few years. You know, Twitter is becoming a really problematic space, not specifically for the choices made by the people who run Twitter, though certainly those too, but simply because it doesn't feel like it is ours. And we take, as human beings, we take a great deal of pride in our communal spaces. We seek to define our communal spaces. And when we can't, when we are thwarted in that endeavor, we react poorly. We react badly. And we react, as many people have this week, by heading on over to mastodon.social, which is the free open source alternative to Twitter. I can't imagine that Mastodon is going to do anything. Like, I can't imagine that's going to be the next big thing, because, guys, I remember when Laconica was the big thing, and that was, gosh, 7, 8, 9 years ago. That was a very long time ago. That was after Twitter had just started. People were talking about Laconica being a better Twitter. And of course, it didn't penetrate the market in quite the same way. But I'm just talking about random things this morning. This is us just speaking of fighting back the darkness, right? I saw some discussion here in the Crowdcast chat right before we started about how much we all hate Mondays and how today is a particularly Monday-ish Monday. So this is us fighting back against the darkness. This is us, lighting a candle. This is one's up, right? We are repudiating the darkness of Monday by hanging out here together. I know that, Karen, are you having terrible time with mail merge? Is that what's going on with you today? That sounds terrible. That sounds absolutely terrible. I hate mail merge. I've been dealing with mail merge since 1990. I have no idea, like the longest time. My entire life I have spent around computers and technology, and there are two things that still refuse to work for me, and by extension for everyone: mail merge and printers. Why are printers still so terrible? Why hasn't someone in the tech industry disrupted printers yet? Why isn't there a sleek little Google cylinder that you can put on your desk that will just wirelessly connect to anything in your house and print whatever you want whenever you want it? Why haven't we made that happen yet? Someone must, right? I think this is the biggest push for the paperless world in which we find ourselves now, is simply that printers suck. If they didn't, we would never have progressed toward e-readers and digital office solutions in quite the way that we have, I'm sure. Printers are the worst, confirms Angela Lurie in all caps there. And Sosa Sunderay tells us that the Dursleys are a Mondayish family. Yes, Mondayish, the worst adjective ever, adds Aaron. Good, absolutely right. Yes, excellent. All right, let's... Ethan is saying, today is essentially my Friday, taking off for holiday until Saturday at about 4:30. Sorry, fam. You're doing it right. This is the right week for you, Ethan. I'm very, very glad. This is working out pretty well. I am hoping to maybe take a little time off tomorrow. Maybe stream a little video game tomorrow. I have been playing just a little bit of late, a little game called Player Unknown's Battlegrounds, which is a 100-player multiplayer shooter set on a wrecked dystopian island somewhere in Eastern Europe, I guess, aesthetically. I'm guessing somewhere in Eastern Europe, judging by the aesthetics of the place and the place names. And finally, yesterday, after playing this game for on and off about 6 weeks, I suppose, I won. I killed everyone else and I won, and it was pretty great, you guys. I got my chicken dinner. I tweeted about it. It was pretty cool. So I'm thinking about maybe streaming some PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds if I get a chance to do that. But as I say, a big week, because we have at least 2 new books to talk about. Let me share the I guess the thing I have here to share is just the newsletter that I sent out, which feels like a little, I don't know, it's getting a little inside baseball here. But look, here we are. This upcoming week, we are, of course, engaged in This Week on Point North right now. Tomorrow, Tuesday, November the 21st, from 10 p.m. Eastern to 11:30 p.m. Eastern, our first Dear Mr. Potter session on A Wizard of Earthsea. We are beginning our 5-week discussion of Ursula K. Le Guin's seminal fantasy series, A Wizard of Earthsea. We are covering 2 chapters a week. So this first session takes us through to Ged being dropped off at Roke. That is the end of the 2nd chapter. So we haven't quite hit wizard school yet, but he has gone through his first adventure and gone through his initial apprenticeship by the time that we get there. That is going to be discussed tomorrow night. So chapters 1 and 2 of A Wizard of Earthsea, tomorrow, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. Then on Wednesday, our There and Back Again session that should have been on Thursday but was moved. As I say, we're discussing King Theoden and our arrival at the Golden Hall of Rohan. Also 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. That's There and Back Again, number 41. And then on Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, we have our first Point North Book Club session. For Patreon supporters, we are discussing the first part of Murder on the Orient Express. And I had a couple of notes this morning from people saying, what is the first part? Can you be more specific? And I guess that in some versions of the book is not split into 3 parts, which is problematic. In the edition of the book that I have, there is clearly part 1, part 2, part 3. Part 1 is the first 3 chapters. That's what we're covering on Friday night. If you haven't been taking part, if you're not a Patreon supporter, if you haven't been taking part in the Point North Book Club sessions or listening to them after the fact, we basically move at a pretty rapid pace. We just covered all of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in 4 weeks. We covered the novel in 4 weeks and then spent a final week talking about the movie adaptation and some other things besides. So we're going to cover Murder on the Orient Express in 3 weeks. Part 1, part Part 2, Part 3, and then we're going to talk about the brand new 2017 Kenneth Branagh adaptation, which I cannot wait to see. I know that the reviews have been a little mixed. I know that perhaps it isn't everyone's favorite version of this story, but I don't care. I love Kenneth Branagh's directorial style personally. I love the cast that we've assembled for this movie. It is at least going to be fascinating. It is at least going to be an interesting time in the movie theater, and I'm hoping also that it's going to be very good. So that is what we are going to discuss this week. Let me see. I'm 20 minutes in, I suppose, because I was a little slow off the bat this morning. Let's take a look at some questions. Leo is asking, what chapters of Wizard of Earthsea are you covering tomorrow? 1 and 2, as I said. Yes, 1 and 2 tomorrow. It's a strong start to the book. One of the great things about A Wizard of Earthsea is that it wastes no time at all. If Ursula K. Le Guin had been writing this book 10 years later, it would have been a trilogy. It would have been, a 3,000-page, Brandon Sanderson epic. It would have been huge. Well, maybe it wouldn't have been, but there would have been pressure for it to be huge, at least. But as it is, it's a slim little volume with enormous quantities of story, enormous depth. So I'm really looking forward to it. That was the decision that led me to, or that was the realization that led me to make this a 5-week series rather than a 4-week series. So we're going to spend all 5 weeks with Wizard of Earthsea, and then we're going to start Goblet of Fire in the first week of January. I believe it is January the 2nd, 2018. We're going to start Goblet of Fire with the first 3 chapters of that book. See, I have a plan in place, ladies and gentlemen. Let me tell you. Angela is asking, Rogue One live stream crowdcast chat event? Yes, definitely. Rogue One, possibly. I would really like to, but definitely Force Awakens. I would like, some of you were with me for the Dear Mr. Potter live commentary track that I did for the Prisoner of Azkaban movie. I would like at some point very soon to go back to the first 2 movies and do a live commentary track for that too. Basically, this is, you can watch the movie at home on your own, but you can also listen to me or watch me on YouTube talk all over it. I would very much like to do one for The Force Awakens before The Last Jedi comes out. So that is going to be one of the things that's very near the top of the list for story in Star Wars. So I think a couple of real lectures, as I say, circling back to The Force Awakens, just a little more critical analysis there, and some reflection on this movie 2 years out now from this film. And some thoughts on Rogue One separately, a separate lecture about Rogue One, because I didn't get to do everything that I wanted to do about Rogue One when I had that session back in April, and at least a live commentary track for The Force Awakens before The Last Jedi comes out. That's my plan. And of course, some of you were with me for the giant marathon all-day live tweet extravaganza that I did a few months ago, where I watched all 7 of the numbered Star Wars movies in a single day. I started at 5 a.m. Central Time and wrapped up 10:30 at night, something like that. It was a long day, and yet it flew by. It flew by, and I had an absolute blast that day. Did have some problems with Twitter limiting my account because I was just tweeting too much, which I suppose is a thing that can happen. But, we live with the technical burdens that are presented to us. We have no choice but to do that. Yes, live commentary is the best, says Becca. That's so great. I'm so glad. Good. Alexa says, Murder on the Orient Express, I think maybe is a favorite for lots of teens. I think you're absolutely right. I think that Murder is... What is it about Murder on the Orient Express? It is written in that particular period of Agatha Christie's career when she was able to begin playing with the tropes and the expectations concerning the mystery novel that she herself had helped to establish, right? She had codified this genre in a very powerful way with the aid of some other writers too, other British writers. G.K. Chesterton, of course, was a very significant member of the Detectives Club at that point. But Christie is the one who defined this type of story, and then she gets to start playing with it, which is really, really interesting. This will not be the last Agatha Christie that we do. I'm kind of penciling in, notionally at least, the idea that we're going to do one Agatha Christie a year. I kind of just like that idea very much as a part of the book club. The book club is going to cover probably 10 texts a year because we're doing this shorter series, so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to, because we're moving more swiftly, cover a more diverse range of books, so it won't be quite so burdensome to spend 12 weeks studying a single volume. We'll be able to move a little more quickly, a little more rapidly. I had a blast doing the Hitchhiker's Guide series, so if you haven't yet heard that, it is all available for you right now. This is one of the things that I get questions about from time to time. If you head on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia and pledge your support, $1 a month, whatever you can afford, to help me do this crazy thing that I do, you get access to everything that is in that archive. And right now, there is a lot. There's a large number, maybe 30 20, 25 weekly Q&A discussions, hour-long Q&A discussions where I just hang out with you, much as I'm hanging out with you now, and just take questions and talk about stuff. And then there's the first Point North Book Club session, 4 sessions on the book of The Hitchhiker's Guide, and then a 5th wrapping everything up. And then, as I say, we're moving on to Murder on the Orient Express this week. It's going to be pretty great. Becca's asking, have you read the G.K. Chesterton Mysteries? Is Father Brown a good adaptation? Because I love that show, and I would totally read if they were similar. I have read the G.K. Chesterton Mysteries. I haven't seen Father Brown, so I don't know how good an adaptation it is. I hear good things. I hear that it's a very faithful adaptation, so I would certainly recommend it, Becca. Chesterton is so good that if you are in any way interested, if you think you might potentially be interested in reading Chesterton, just go read Chesterton, because the chances of you liking it are actually very, very high. Right? This is not something that I would say about all authors. Most people like at least one adaptation of the works of Philip K. Dick, for example. They'll like Blade Runner or something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should go and read Philip K. Dick. Like, the experience of reading his work is very, very, very different oftentimes. So yeah, I'm not sure that I would recommend it. Oh, Aaron is recommending one of my favorite books, The Man Who Was Thursday. I love that book. It is fantastic. It is baffling. I went through a period of reading, this would have been in about, 2005, 2006, 2007, something like that. I went through a period of reading a bunch of books which were metatextual and kind of reflexively literary. I was kind of stretching my philosophical muscles within the literary space during that period, and it was during that period that I first read The Man Who Was Thursday, which is just a knockout. I absolutely recommend that too. The other one that I would recommend, this is not in any way related to G.K. Chesterton, but if you haven't read The Third Policeman, which was... Gosh, was that an Easter egg in Lost? I think that was maybe an Easter egg in Lost. I think that was what led me to The Third Policeman. Go read that book. It is baffling. It is fantastic and completely a completely wild read. I don't want to talk about it at all. That would be a great one actually to do for the Point North Book Club. That would be a fascinating book to read. I haven't read that in a couple of years, but I would love to go back to it again. All right, that I think is going to do it. We're a half hour, and guys, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for keeping me company. I hope that we're all excited for the week to come. I guess if you have any last minute questions, you can probably try and type very quickly into the question box while I'm doing this wrap up thing. As I say, if you are interested in registration for the live Between Worlds class, head on over to pointnorthmedia.com, click the classes button. You'll find the album art there. You can register there. There is an early bird special registration running right now, so you can get it for cheap, which is going to be pretty good for everyone involved since we're coming up on the holidays and such like. If you can't make the live session, or if you'd rather just move through it at your own pace, then hang around, because in the middle of February next year, we'll have a downloadable version of that class available. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm very, very excited. I'm looking forward to recording a couple of little extra things. One of the things that I want to do that will be made available for people who have registered for the class probably before New Year. I think I'm going to have to get this done and get it out maybe between Christmas and New Year when I have a little extra time. I want to record an audio version of Sir Orfeo in the Middle English, right? You can get translations of Sir Orfeo, and we'll be talking about translations of Sir Orfeo just because the Middle English is a little bit, it's an extra barrier to our comprehension as we're trying to study it, but you should definitely look at the original Middle English, and I would like to try, sharpen my pronunciation and my syntactical skill here with my Middle English. I would like to try to read the Middle English version of Sir Orfeo for you. It's not terribly long. It's only, gosh, maybe 10 or 15 minutes long. It's really a trivial piece of poetry in that regard, but it sounds pretty cool. When Middle English is read aloud, it sounds really, really good. So that's going to be a fun thing to look forward to. I think that will do it then. Guys, thank you all so much for joining me. I will see you all again tomorrow for Dear Mr. Potter and our discussion of A Wizard of Earthsea, or on Wednesday for There and Back Again and our discussion of King Theoden and his Golden Hall, or on Friday for our first discussion of Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. Until then, have a great week. Don't let Monday get you down, and take care.